In the dust of a forgotten ledger, one name refused to die. A child born into chains, yet never sold, never counted, never free. For 43 years she lived in the open air of a southern plantation while an entire family swore she did not exist. This is not a story of slavery. This is a story of a sin so heavy it had to be hidden from God Himself. The air in the study of Riverstone Plantation smelled of damp leather, candle smoke, and the faint rot of old paper. It was a humid afternoon in the spring of 1847, and Henry Prescott, 12-year overseer, a man whose hands had counted more souls than most men ever meet, stood frozen over a ledger that should never have survived the auction block. Outside, the cotton fields lay fallow and silent, the great house stripped of its silver and portraits, the Ashton family name already crumbling under debt and disgrace. But inside these pages, something older than bankruptcy refused to let go. One entry. Repeated. 43 years without interruption. Rose, clothing, 2 yards muslin. Rose, shoes, repaired. Rose, fever, Dr. Hargrove called. No sale. No transfer. No bill of sale. No census mark. No grave. Just a living ghost written in ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. Henry's fingers trembled as he turned the page. He had spent his life reducing human beings to columns and numbers. He knew the cold arithmetic of bondage better than any preacher knew his Bible. But this was not arithmetic. This was blasphemy against the very order of the world the Ashtons claimed God had ordained. He closed the book. The latch clicked like a coffin lid. And in the silence that followed, the question that would haunt the rest of his days rose like fever. Why would a family spend nearly half a century hiding a child they refused to sell? What kind of sin demands that you keep the evidence breathing right under your roof while pretending before God and man that she was never born? This is the story of Rose. Not the story of a slave who was freed, not the story of a slave who was sold. The story of the slave who was never allowed to exist, and yet refused to disappear. Riverstone Plantation sat like a white wound on the red clay of Beaufort District, South Carolina. 2,400 acres of prime bottomland that had once drunk the blood and sweat of 7 souls in chains. The main house, Georgian columns, wide porches, a widow's walk that stared out over an ocean of cotton, had been built in 1789 on the bones of an older colonial cabin. The land itself carried memory. Before the Ashtons, it had belonged to Cornelius Hartley, whose widow sold it cheap after his sudden death. Thomas Ashton, merchant turned planter, had bought it with money still warm from the Charleston slave pens. By 1804 the family presented the face the Lowcountry expected: respectable, church-going, quietly prosperous. Thomas Ashton, 53, broad-shouldered and iron-willed, walked the fields at dawn like a man inspecting his own soul. His wife, Catherine, 20 years younger, raised among Charleston's merchant elite, spoke French, read Voltaire in secret, and played Mozart on the pianoforte while the field hands sang work songs that drifted through the open windows like accusations. Their children, Margaret, 18, James, 16, William, 12, had been raised to believe the world was ordered exactly as scripture and custom demanded. They attended St. Andrew's every Sunday. They tithed. They spoke of Christian duty. And they owned 87 black souls the way other men owned horses. None of them, not even Thomas, would have called themselves cruel. They called themselves practical. Then, in the spring of 1804, practicality met its limit. A woman named Lydia arrived from Charleston. The bill of sale was brief: Negro wench, age approximate 22, condition good, domestic service. She was assigned to the big house, cooking, laundering, moving silently through the family's private rooms like furniture that could breathe. She was also 6 months pregnant. That fact never appeared in any ledger. Not the overseers. Not the tax rolls. Not the 1805 census that would soon sweep across South Carolina like a divine accounting. But in Catherine Ashton's private journal, pages later discovered in 1923, hidden behind a loose brick in the smokehouse, there is a single trembling line written in May. L has been brought to the house. T insists on discretion. The child will be born in the summer. We have agreed on arrangements. I confess that I do not fully understand what is expected of me, But I have learned that questions are not welcome in such matters. The night of the birth came in July like judgment. A sweltering, windless dark. Heat lightning flickered over the cotton fields, turning the white bolls into ghosts. Lydia had been moved days earlier to the small cottage behind the kitchen garden, its walls still smelling of lye soap and dried herbs. Thomas Ashton stood in the corner like a sentinel. Catherine sat at the bedside, her fine hands that had never picked cotton, now gripping a blood-stained cloth. Midwife Ruth, an enslaved woman who had delivered half the plantation's children, moved with the calm of someone who had seen too much. Dr. Hargrove arrived on a lathered horse, 60 years old, eyes heavy with the knowledge that some questions were never asked in the South. The labor was long. The child was breech. For hours the only sounds were Lydia's ragged breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. Then, as the first gray light bled across the fields, a thin, furious cry split the air. A girl. Dr. Hargrove held her up to the lantern. The infant's skin was the color of weak tea and cream, light enough to tell a story no one wanted told aloud. He said nothing. He did not need to. Every adult in that room understood the sin that had just been born. Thomas named her Rose. And then he made the decision that would damn them all. She would not be sold. She would not be freed. She would not be acknowledged. She would simply vanish into the household while remaining perfectly visible. A living contradiction. A child who existed in the flesh but not in law. A daughter of the house who was also property. Catherine's journal entries after that night grow heavier, as though the ink itself carried weight. August 1804. T has made his position clear. The child is to remain here. She is to be raised as part of the household, but her status is to remain ambiguous. He says it is for the best for all of us. I do not entirely understand his reasoning, but I have learned not to question him on such matters. By September the tone shifts from confusion to something colder, resignation edged with complicity. Lydia has been moved permanently to the cottage. Rose remains with her. The servants know not to speak. T has made certain of that. There is a quality of fear in their silence that suggests he was very clear about the consequences of indiscretion. Thomas Ashton did not rule by cruelty alone. He ruled by precision. Money flowed to those who could be trusted. Intimidation and quiet, surgical, removed those who could not. Overseers were told to ignore certain discrepancies in the counts. New field hands were kept away from the domestic quarters. Neighbors who glimpsed a small light-skinned girl playing near the garden were given vague stories about a distant cousin's child or a servant's orphan. The silence that settled over Riverstone was not ignorance. It was a covenant. Every soul on the place, black and white, understood that Rose was the one subject that could never be spoken. To name her was to risk everything. But why? Catherine's journal never names the father outright. Yet the clues are scattered like broken glass. October 1804. T says the matter is settled. He has spoken to the man in question. There will be no further complications. The child will be provided for. That is all that needs to be said. Historians who later studied the Ashton papers point to the most likely man, Richard Ashton, Thomas's younger brother, 30 years old, unmarried, and already notorious in the quarters for appetites that required no consent. Richard lived at Riverstone, managed the day-to-day brutality of the fields, and carried the family name like a weapon. If Rose was Richard's daughter, then Thomas faced a horror deeper than mere scandal. The child carried Ashton blood, white blood, yet was legally chattel. To sell her was to scatter the family's sin across the South. To free her was to admit the crime. To acknowledge her was to destroy the reputation that kept their credit good and their pew warm at church. So Thomas chose the cruelest mercy of all, official non-existence. He would feed her, clothe her, shelter her, while ensuring the world believed she was not there. Catherine understood the cost. In a November entry her handwriting grows jagged. I have heard raised voices from T's study. R's voice was angry and defensive. T's was cold, controlled. When R emerged, he would not meet anyone's eyes. I understand that some kind of agreement has been reached. I do not ask. I have learned that asking questions is not welcome. Weeks later, the mask slips entirely. I do not approve of this course of action. But I understand that T believes it is the only way to preserve the family's reputation. I have agreed to keep silent. I have made the children promise to keep silent. What choice do we have? If I were to speak, would T turn me out? Would he have me committed? I have seen what happens to women who challenge their husbands. I have seen them isolated, discredited, destroyed. And so I remain silent. And in remaining silent, I become complicit. Those words are among the most devastating ever written by a Southern mistress. A woman of intelligence and conscience watching herself participate in the slow erasure of a human soul because the alternative was her own destruction. As Rose grew, the secret became a living thing that required constant feeding. She learned to walk on the same paths her half-siblings walked. She ate at the same table scraps. She breathed the same air. Yet she was never listed. Never schooled in public. Never allowed to speak her own name outside the cottage walls. Catherine herself became the keeper of the lie. She taught Rose to read. In secret. She taught her to sew. She watched the child's quick mind bloom and wrote in 1810, when Rose was 6. Rose is remarkably intelligent, perhaps more intelligent than Margaret was at the same age. She learns quickly. She asks thoughtful questions. Sometimes I forget for a moment that she is what she is. And then I remember, and I feel a terrible sadness that I cannot quite explain. I wonder sometimes if this is what guilt feels like. Guilt. The word hangs in the journal like incense over an altar no one dared approach. Because by then the Ashtons were no longer simply hiding a child. They were hiding a judgment. A living reminder that the blood they claimed as superior could be mixed, diluted, and still carry the family name in secret. A reminder that their Christian virtue was a performance staged on the backs of people they refused to see as fully human. And somewhere in the humid nights of Riverstone, the God they prayed to every Sunday was already keeping his own ledger, one that would not be balanced for another 43 years. But that is a story for later. For now, a 6-year-old girl named Rose still ran barefoot through the kitchen garden, her laughter drifting across the fields like something forbidden, while an entire plantation learned to look straight through her as though she were already a ghost. And the ledger, quiet, meticulous, damning, kept counting the days of a life that officially did not exist. The candlelight in Catherine Ashton's private sitting room flickered across the pages of her hidden journal like a guilty conscience refusing to rest. It was 1812, and outside the heavy drapes the low-country night pressed in, cicadas screaming their relentless chorus, the distant crack of a whip from the quarters reminding everyone of the order of things. Inside, Catherine sat with trembling hands, ink staining her fingers as she wrote words she could never speak aloud. I wonder if this sadness will ever leave me, she confessed. I have taught her French. She has a gift for languages, her accent is almost flawless, as though the words were born on her tongue. I have taught her the pianoforte. Her fingers are long and graceful, she possesses an intuitive grasp of melody that moves me to tears. In the evenings I hear her playing from the cottage. The music drifts across the garden like prayer, beautiful, pure, and utterly heartbreaking. Because I know she will never play for guests in a drawing room. She will never perform before an audience that matters. These gifts are seeds planted in soil that will never be allowed to bloom. Catherine Ashton was educating a ghost. Rose, now 8 years old, was receiving the same rigorous training given to the daughters of Charleston's finest families. French conversation. Needlework intricate enough for a trousseau. Literature, history, basic philosophy. Skills meant to transform a girl into a refined Southern lady capable of managing a household, charming suitors, and upholding the fragile theater of respectability. But Rose was not Margaret. Rose was not destined for balls, courtship, or a respectable marriage under the live oaks. Rose was the living evidence of a sin the Ashton men had committed in the shadows. Every lesson carried the weight of exquisite cruelty. Catherine knew it. The journal entries from these years bleed with self-awareness, the slow dawning horror of a woman who had once believed herself enlightened, now watching herself become the architect of another human being's exquisite torment. By 1815, Rose was 11. She had never left the boundaries of Riverstone Plantation. Her entire universe consisted of the small whitewashed cottage behind the kitchen garden where she lived with her mother Lydia, the shaded paths where she was permitted to walk only during certain quiet hours, and the private rooms of the big house where Catherine conducted her secret lessons. She knew she was different. She knew the other children, her half-siblings, could ride into town, attend church, have their names written in the family Bible. She knew there were rooms she could enter only when no visitors were present, and silences that fell whenever she walked into a space where outsiders might see. She asked questions only a child with a sharp mind would ask. Why can I not go to town with Margaret? Why am I not allowed in church? Why is my name not written anywhere? Catherine's answers were gentle evasions wrapped in the language of protection. It is complicated, my dear. It is for your own safety. Someday, perhaps, things will be different. But in the journal, the mask fell away. She has begun to ask about her mother. She wants to know who her father is. She wants to know why she must hide. These are reasonable questions, questions any child would ask. And I have no answers I can give her. The truth would destroy her. Or it would destroy us. Or both. So I continue to lie. I continue to evade. I continue to pretend that this cage we have built around her is kindness. As the years passed, the education continued with relentless thoroughness. By the time Rose turned 18 in 1822, she was fluent in French, could sight-read complex pieces on the pianoforte, produced needlework fine enough for any Charleston salon, and had absorbed enough literature and moral philosophy to hold her own in conversation if only the world had been permitted to hear her voice. She was, in every respect, except the legal one, a young lady of quality. And she was a prisoner in a cage whose bars had been polished until they gleamed. Catherine's journal from 1820, when Rose was 16, contains one of the most devastating passages. I have created a monster. Not Rose, Rose is not a monster. I have created a situation that is monstrous. I have educated a young woman for a life she will never be allowed to live. I have given her the tools to understand her own oppression. I have taught her to think, to question, to aspire, and then I have locked the door. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been kinder to leave her ignorant. Sometimes I wonder if my education is a form of torture. Sometimes I wonder if I am a good woman who has done a terrible thing, or a terrible woman who has convinced herself she is good. This was the spiritual heart of the crime. The Ashtons had not merely hidden a child. They had refined her soul until it could feel the full weight of its own chains, then demanded she pretend the chains did not exist. They had given her the eyes to see injustice while forbidding her the right to name it. In biblical terms, they had fed her from the tree of knowledge and then banished her from any garden where that knowledge could bear fruit. It was a sophisticated form of soul murder, slower, more elegant, and in many ways more devastating than the lash. Then, in 1820, the fragile architecture of the secret began to crack. Thomas Ashton died at 79. His death was not dramatic, just the slow failing of a man who had ruled his small kingdom with iron precision. The will was read in the formal parlor, the family gathered beneath portraits that stared down with ancestral judgment. The plantation was divided among the legitimate children. Margaret had already married and moved away. James, now 36, assumed control of Riverstone. William had gone to Charleston to pursue law. Nowhere in Thomas's will was there any mention of Rose. No provision. No instruction. No acknowledgement that the girl who had lived under his roof for 16 years even existed. Catherine's journal after the funeral is frantic, the handwriting hurried and uneven. Thomas is gone. And with him the only person who truly understood the necessity of our arrangement. James does not approve. He has made this clear. He says the situation is untenable. He says Rose must be dealt with. He uses that word as if she were a broken plow or a lame horse rather than a person, his own blood. James Ashton was a man shaped by his time. He believed fervently in the natural hierarchy ordained by God and nature, white over black, master over slave, legitimate blood over illegitimate. The mixing of races was, to him, not merely regrettable, it was an abomination that threatened the divine order. He viewed his father's decision to hide Rose as weakness, a sentimental failure that now endangered the family's reputation and financial standing. A visible, educated young woman of mixed blood living on the plantation was a powder keg. One loose word to the wrong neighbor, one census inquiry, one spiteful overseer, and the entire Ashton edifice could collapse under scandal. James demanded a decision. Catherine, now in her late 60s, her health failing, could not fight him with the old authority. But neither could she bring herself to sell Rose like livestock or have her quietly removed. In 1822 she negotiated a desperate compromise. Rose would be listed in the household accounts not as property, but as a paid servant. A poor relation taken in by the family. It was irregular, but precedents existed for free people of color working in white households. She would receive a small wage, money she had no opportunity to spend, since she still could not leave the grounds. James agreed, though resentment burned in his eyes. Catherine knew it was only a reprieve. When she was gone, James would act. The compromise bought time, but it could not silence the growing questions. In Rose's heart. In 1824 Catherine wrote, "Rose has asked me about her future. She has asked what will happen to her when I am gone. She has asked if she will ever be free. She has asked if there is anyone in the world who truly knows who she is. I have no answers. I have told her we will discuss it when she is older. But I fear I am simply delaying the inevitable. I fear I am being cruel in my kindness." Catherine Ashton died in February 1825 at 78. On her deathbed, surrounded by her legitimate children, she asked that Rose be allowed into the room. The young woman, now 21, stood in the shadows at the edge of the lamplight, neither fully family nor fully servant. Catherine's last recorded words were spoken directly to her. "You are real. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what the records say, you are real. You are a person. You matter. Remember that." After Catherine's death, her hidden journals were discovered by Margaret. What Margaret read shocked her, but instead of burying the truth, she confronted her brother James with a ferocity no one had expected. "I will not permit you to sell her," Margaret declared in a letter later preserved. "I will not permit you to erase her. If you attempt it, I will make certain the entire world knows what Father did, what we have all done. I will destroy this family's reputation before I allow you to destroy her." James, pragmatic above all, blinked. He recognized real power when he saw it. Another compromise was struck, colder this time. Rose would be sent away. Not sold. Not destroyed. Exiled. She was to live with a distant relative, a widow named Ella Hartwell, on a modest 200-acre farm outside Augusta, Georgia. The arrangement was presented as employment, room, board, and household duties in exchange for her labor. Margaret provided a carefully worded letter of introduction that revealed nothing of Rose's true origins, only that she was a young woman of good character and unusual education. Rose was 21 years old when she left Riverstone, the only home she had ever known. She had never seen a city street. Never spoken with anyone outside the tightly controlled circle of the plantation. Never tasted freedom, though every book Catherine had given her had described its shape. When she arrived at Ella Lanina's modest but well-kept farm, the widow was startled. She had expected a simple servant. Instead, she received a quiet, withdrawn young woman who could converse in French, manage accounts with precision, play the pianoforte with genuine feeling, and discuss literature as though she had been born to it. "The girl that Margaret sent me is quite remarkable," Ella Lanina wrote to a friend in 1826. "Quiet, almost haunted, but there is an intelligence in her eyes that suggests a far more complex story than the one I was told. I have not pressed her. Discretion seems expected. Yet I confess I am curious. There is something about her that speaks of a life lived entirely in shadow." On that small Georgia farm, something began to shift in Rose. Ella Lanina Hartwell was no ordinary Southern widow. She held quiet but unmistakable progressive views. She had corresponded with Northern abolitionist circles. She had, on more than one occasion, provided discreet shelter to those fleeing bondage. Her farm was worked by enslaved labor, but she also employed free workers and treated them with a dignity rare in her time. Among them was Samuel, a free man of color, born in Philadelphia to a free black mother and a white father who had acknowledged him and paid for his education. Samuel had come south seeking opportunity and respect, managing the day-to-day operations of the farm with quiet competence and integrity. In this unlikely place, far from the suffocating silence of Riverstone, Rose began, slowly and painfully, to heal. Not completely. The wounds of being told for 21 years that she was both visible and invisible ran too deep. But for the first time she lived among people who did not require her to disappear. She managed the household. She kept the accounts. She helped organize the farm's modest operations. And in quiet conversations with Samuel under the Georgia stars, she began to understand that the natural order she had been taught at Riverstone was not divine law, it was a choice. A cruel, man-made choice that could be challenged. The education Catherine had given her, the very gift that had once felt like torture, now became the key that unlocked a different kind of future. But the past is never truly left behind. The ledger from Riverstone still existed. The family in South Carolina still watched. And somewhere in the humid air between Georgia and the Lowcountry, the question of what to do with the woman who refused to remain a ghost continued to hover like divine judgment waiting for its appointed time. Because Rose was never truly sold. She was never truly free. She simply continued to exist in the spaces between what the world was willing to see and what God had always known was there. The Georgia sun filtered through the live oaks surrounding Ella Lanina Hartwell's modest farm, casting dappled patterns across the wide porch where two figures sat in quiet conversation. It was 1829. Rose, 25 now, her features carrying the delicate trace of Ashton blood mixed with the strength of her mother's lineage, listened as Samuel, the free man of color who managed the farm's operations, spoke of a world she had only glimpsed in forbidden books. Samuel understood the margins of society better than most. Born free in Philadelphia to a black mother and a white father who had dared to acknowledge him, he had been educated, yet still carried the invisible scars of a nation that measured humanity by fractions of blood. He knew what it meant to be seen and yet not fully seen. To move through the world while carrying the constant awareness that your very existence challenged someone else's ordered universe. Ella Lanina Hartwell observed them with a mixture of tenderness and quiet approval. In her private writings she noted, "I have observed that Rose and Samuel spend considerable time together. They discuss books, philosophy, the nature of freedom and whether justice can exist in a world built upon its denial. They have developed a genuine friendship. Both are isolated souls in their way. They have found in each other a companionship rare and precious." Samuel opened doors in Rose's mind that Catherine's elegant lessons had only hinted at. He spoke of the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Of free black communities in Philadelphia and Boston where men and women owned property, published newspapers, and dared to argue that slavery was not merely unfortunate but a profound offense against God and humanity. He told her there were people fighting the very system that had tried to render her non-existent. One evening, as fireflies danced over the fields, Rose confided in Ella Lanina, "I have never known anyone like Samuel. He speaks of freedom as though it is something possible, something I might actually claim. I have spent my entire life being told I do not exist, that I have no status, no rights. And now he tells me I can be free. I do not know if I believe him yet. But oh, how I want to." Ella Lanina, progressive in ways that made her neighbors whisper, encouraged the friendship. She saw in Rose a woman who had maintained dignity, intelligence, and compassion despite years of deliberate erasure. "You are a remarkable woman," she told Rose one afternoon while they shelled peas on the porch. "You have been treated abominably, denied everything a soul deserves. Yet you have kept your mind sharp and your heart open. That inner freedom no one can take from you. You have already begun to claim it." For 4 years Rose built something resembling a life on that small Georgia farm. She managed the household with quiet efficiency. She helped with accounts. She found purpose in the rhythm of daily work among people who did not require her to vanish. She was 26 in 1830 when the past reached out across the miles with a cold, unexpected hand. James Ashton died at 46. Childless, unmarried, he left Riverstone Plantation to his younger brother William, the lawyer in Charleston who had absorbed the intellectual currents of the age, ideas about natural rights, human dignity, and the moral stain of slavery. William was not like his father or elder brother. He had read the philosophers. He had wrestled with scripture and conscience. When he took control of Riverstone, he ordered a thorough review of the household accounts. That is when the anomaly surfaced: a woman listed as a paid servant for years, yet never actually present on the grounds after 1825. A name that appeared nowhere in the official census or inventory. Shocked, William began to investigate. He read his mother Catherine's hidden journals. He spoke with aging household staff who still remembered the girl who lived in the cottage behind the kitchen garden. He pieced together the full, damning story: the secret birth in 1804, the decades of deliberate non-existence, the fragile compromises after his father's death, the exile to Georgia. The more William learned, the heavier the moral weight became. Here was his own family practicing one of the most insidious forms of bondage, not the lash, but the erasure of a human soul from the record of creation itself. A sin against both man and God. He made inquiries and discovered Rose was still in Georgia with Ella Lenina Hartwell. In 1831, William wrote a letter that would echo through history. Discovered decades later among Ella Lenina's papers, it read with raw candor: Dear Mrs. Hartwell, I write regarding a matter of considerable delicacy. Rose is my half-sister, though this relationship has never been acknowledged. She is the daughter of my father and an enslaved woman named Lydia, born at Riverstone in 1804 and hidden from the world for the first 22 years of her life. I have come to believe this was a grave injustice. I wish to offer Rose her freedom, not merely the shadow of it she has claimed, but official, documented manumission. I wish to provide her with a sum sufficient to establish herself independently. I wish to acknowledge her publicly as my sister and ensure she is never again treated as though she does not exist. I ask you to consider what it means to be erased from the world. I ask you to consider the basic recognition of one's own existence. I stand ready to do what is right, regardless of convenience. Ella Lenina's reply was equally measured and moving. She confessed she had long suspected a deeper story. She had spoken with Rose, who asked for time to consider. She is cautious, Ella Lenina wrote, and rightly so. She has learned that hope can be cruel. Yet I believe she will accept, not for the money, but for the acknowledgement that she exists, that she matters, that her life holds value. This, I suspect, is what she has sought all along. After careful thought, conversations with Samuel and Ella Lenina, and deep reflection on what claiming her name would truly mean, Rose accepted. In 1832 she was formally manumitted. William provided $500, a substantial sum, and publicly acknowledged her as his sister. The scandal detonated across Charleston society like cannon fire. The Ashton name, carefully guarded for generations through church attendance, strategic marriages, and quiet complicity, shattered. William was ostracized. Invitations ceased. Business associates distanced themselves. Whispers followed him in the streets: traitor to his race, betrayer of family, fool who elevated a woman of mixed blood to the status of kin. William did not flinch. In a letter to a friend he wrote, I have acknowledged my sister. I have ensured she will never again be treated as non-existent. If this costs me my reputation, so be it. My reputation is a small price for justice, for the recognition of another human being's right to exist. The ripples spread. Margaret, who had once threatened to expose the family to protect Rose, faced fury from her husband. He demanded she repudiate her brother and the woman now publicly named as their half-sister. Margaret refused. In a letter to William she reflected on their mother's burden, the slow erosion of conscience through silence. I will not carry that burden. I will not be complicit in the erasure of another soul. Some things matter more than marriage. More than social standing. More than the comfort of lies. Rose used her freedom and the modest funds to move to Philadelphia, the vibrant hub of free black life and abolitionist activity. There, amid a community that supported schools for black children and produced leaders who challenged the nation's conscience, she opened a small school. She taught reading, literature, history, and critical thinking. She taught the children, many born free, some recently manumitted, that every soul deserved dignity. She became quietly involved in abolitionist circles, sharing her story not for spectacle but as living testimony to slavery's deeper crimes, the crime of denying a person's very existence. In one recorded speech she said, "I was erased, hidden, denied the basic recognition of my own being. Yet I survived, because some refused to accept the system that tried to unmake me. Education gave me eyes to see my oppression. Strength kept me standing. But not everyone has such mercy. Therefore we must fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. We must fight until slavery itself is erased from God's earth." She never married, never had children of her own. But she claimed something stolen from her for 28 years, agency. The right to define her own life rather than be defined by the fears and sins of others. Meanwhile, Riverstone Plantation began its slow death. William, now convinced slavery was a moral evil, moved to free the remaining enslaved people. It was a radical, costly decision. Without unpaid labor, the economics collapsed. Paid workers demanded fair wages and could leave for better opportunities. The grand machine built on human bondage ground to a halt. By 1840 the plantation was in steep decline. By 1845 it faced liquidation. The new owner was Thomas Hartley, a Charleston merchant enriched by the slave trade. He had no interest in old secrets or moral reckonings, only profit. He installed a new overseer, Henry Prescott, a practical man in his 50s with decades of experience wringing productivity from the land and the people upon it. In 1847, while cataloging records before auction, Prescott opened the old ledger. There it was, the name Rose repeated with meticulous entries for clothing, food, medical care, 43 years of quiet documentation for a soul the official world had tried to pretend never existed. Prescott's hands stilled. He understood the cold language of plantation records better than scripture. This was not an accounting error. This was evidence of a deliberate, sustained act of spiritual violence, an entire family conspiring for decades to hide a child in plain sight while swearing before God and man that she was not there. The ledger did not lie. But the deeper truth was even more unsettling: Rose had refused to remain erased. She had stepped into the light, spoken her name, and in doing so exposed the rotten foundation beneath the elegant columns of Riverstone and the polite society that had sustained it. Some sins, once brought into the open, cannot be hidden again. They demand reckoning, whether through conscience, scandal, financial ruin, or the slow collapse of a way of life built on denial. Riverstone's fields, once white with cotton like an ocean of false purity, now stood as testament to a haunting legacy, the cost of trying to unmake a human being created in the image of God. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman who had once been called a ghost continued her quiet work, teaching children that no ledger, no law, no family conspiracy could ever truly erase a soul that God Himself had numbered. The secret that began in a sweltering birthroom in 1804 had finally broken free. But the divine ledger, the one that counts every tear, every silenced cry, every act of complicity and every act of courage, had been keeping its own meticulous record all along. Henry Prescott stood alone in the dust-filled study of Riverstone Plantation as afternoon light slanted through cracked shutters like a reluctant confession. It was 1847. The grand house, once proud with white columns and echoing laughter, now smelled of mildew, neglect, and the sour breath of impending auction. The Ashton family's empire had crumbled under debt, scandal, and the slow poison of its own secrets. Prescott, 50-something, weathered by decades of managing men and land, practical to his bones, had been hired by the new owner, Thomas Hartley, to catalog every asset before the sale. He expected the usual grim arithmetic of plantation life, lists of tools, livestock, field hands reduced to cold numbers. What he did not expect was a name that refused to vanish. Rose. 43 consecutive years of entries. Clothing. Shoes. Medical care. Small sums for food. All meticulously recorded in changing handwriting across decades, yet the name appeared nowhere in the official census, no bill of sale, no transfer, no grave marker. A living contradiction breathing between the lines of every ledger the South used to justify itself before God and man. Prescott closed the book slowly. The latch clicked like a gavel. He felt something shift inside him, not mere curiosity, but a deeper disturbance, as though he had stumbled upon evidence of a sin committed not in passion but in cold, calculated silence. A sin against the very order of creation. He did what any man who had spent his life enforcing the system would do. He asked questions, he spoke with the few remaining elderly household staff who had survived the decline. He walked the overgrown paths to the cottage behind the kitchen garden, now sagging and vine-choked. He listened to hesitant voices, to memories delivered in whispers. Piece by piece the story emerged, the secret birth on a sweltering July night in 1804, the breeched child with skin too light for comfort, Thomas Ashton's ruthless decision to hide her in plain sight, Catherine's tormented journals, the fragile compromises after Thomas's death, James's cold pragmatism, William's late awakening of conscience, and finally the quiet exile to Georgia followed by public acknowledgment that shattered the family's standing. The more Prescott learned, the more the weight pressed upon him. In a letter to a trusted friend he wrote with uncharacteristic vulnerability, "I have discovered something at Riverstone I do not fully understand. A person hidden for decades. Erased from every official record, yet carefully provided for clothing, food, medicine, as though someone could not bring themselves to destroy her, but also could not bear to let her fully exist. It is wrong. A violation of something fundamental in the soul of man. A secret kept with such precision that it feels like blasphemy against the God who numbers every hair on every head." Most men in Prescott's position would have burned the pages or simply ignored the inconsistency to protect the sale. But something, perhaps the fear of divine accounting, perhaps a long-buried sense of justice, moved him differently. He made careful copies of the ledger entries. He wrote detailed notes. He preserved the physical evidence of a life that the official world had tried to unmake. Then he did something truly unusual, he decided to find her. It took months of quiet inquiry, letters to Charleston contacts, traces through William Ashton's diminished circle, finally a thread leading north to Philadelphia. In 1848 Henry Prescott sat down and wrote to Rose Ashton, enclosing copies of the ledger pages that proved her existence had been recorded, even if in secret. Rose's reply, preserved in the family papers, is one of the most haunting documents of the era. Written in clear, educated hand, it carries the quiet dignity of a woman who had long since learned the cost of hoping. "Dear Mr. Prescott, I received your letter with considerable emotion. For so many years I was told I did not exist, that I was a ghost in my own family's house, a complication to be managed, a secret to be kept. And yet, as you have shown me, I was documented. Counted in secret. Acknowledged in the only way they could bring themselves to do it. It is a strange form of recognition, not the one I deserved, not the freedom I longed for, but recognition nonetheless. Proof that I was real. That my life mattered enough to be written down, even if only in the shadows. I am grateful to you for seeking me out. For preserving these pages. For ensuring that part of my truth would not be lost to the dust. I have spent my life trying to prove I exist. Now I hold evidence that cannot be denied. Yours in gratitude. Rose Ashton." Rose lived until 1878. She died at 74 in a modest but owned house in Philadelphia, surrounded by books, letters from former students, and the quiet artifacts of a life reclaimed. Her death notice in a local newspaper was brief and dignified: Rose Ashton, teacher and philanthropist, passed after a long life devoted to education and the cause of human freedom. No mention of Riverstone. No mention of the cottage behind the kitchen garden. No mention of the 43 years she spent as a living ghost. But the records endured. Catherine's anguished journals. Ella Lenina Hartwell's thoughtful letters. William's courageous correspondence. The household ledgers with their meticulous, damning entries. Henry Prescott's copies and notes. All of them waited in archives and family papers like seeds buried in dry soil. In 1923, historian Margaret Thornton, researching the domestic realities of South Carolina slavery, opened the donated Ashton collection at a university library. As she read Catherine's coded entries, the fear, the guilt, the slow moral erosion, the full story began to rise like mist off the rice fields. Thornton published her findings in a scholarly article titled "The Invisible Woman, Rose Ashton and the Hidden History of Riverstone Plantation." The piece sent ripples through academic circles. It forced uncomfortable questions: how many other names had been deliberately omitted from the official ledgers of American history? How many souls had been erased not by violence alone, but by the quiet conspiracy of silence, paperwork, and social necessity? The article suggested something deeper and more spiritually chilling, that the true horror of slavery was not only physical bondage but the systematic denial of personhood itself, the attempt to unwrite human beings from the book of life while they still drew breath. Rose Ashton became a symbol, not merely of victimhood, but of resilience against erasure. Scholars returned to the papers with new eyes. They saw Thomas Ashton not as simple monster but as a man trapped by the very hierarchy he defended, a man who chose secret documentation over outright destruction because some remnant of conscience, or fear of divine judgment, would not let him fully extinguish the child who carried his brother's blood. They saw Catherine as both perpetrator and prisoner, a woman of intelligence who educated the girl she helped hide, loving her enough to teach her French and Mozart, yet lacking the courage or power to set her truly free. Her journals reveal the terrible cost of complicity, the slow death of conscience through daily compromise. James appeared as the cold guardian of order, willing to remove the threat Rose represented to the family's reputation and the racial hierarchy he believed divinely ordained. William emerged as the complicated redeemer, a man who paid for justice with his social standing, choosing conscience over comfort in an age when few did. And Rose herself stood as the quiet victor. She took the education meant to torment her and used it to teach others. She accepted William's acknowledgment without bitterness, yet never returned to the South. She built a life of purpose in Philadelphia, insisting on her own existence through every child she taught to read and every quiet word she spoke against the institution that had tried to unmake her. Her story forces questions that still echo with spiritual weight. Was Rose truly unique, or merely one of many invisible souls living in the cracks of the slave system, documented in private ledgers yet denied before the law and before God? Did Thomas hide her partly out of a twisted sense of responsibility, believing secret existence better than sale or public shame? Did Rose ever fully forgive? The record suggests understanding, especially toward Catherine and William, but no warm reconciliation. She claimed her freedom and moved forward, a survivor who refused to let the past define her future. What of Lydia, her mother? The woman who endured the birth, raised the child in the shadows, and then disappears almost entirely from the records, a ghost behind the ghost. Her erasure feels even more complete, a final cruelty layered upon cruelty. Above all, Rose Ashton's life reveals the true nature of the system. Slavery was never only about labor. It was about control of reality itself, who counts as fully human, who may speak, who may be remembered. It corrupted masters and mistresses, forcing them to lie to their children, their neighbors, their God. It demanded the constant maintenance of fictions that ate away at the soul. Yet within that darkness, resistance took many forms: the quiet protection Catherine offered within her limits, William's costly public stand, Rose's steadfast insistence on her own worth, and even Henry Prescott's unexpected decision to preserve the truth rather than bury it. The plantation itself did not long survive the exposure. Riverstone's fields fell silent. Its columns weathered and cracked. The grand house became a hollow shell, its secrets finally leaking into the light. Rose was never sold. She was never fully freed until William's act of conscience. She was never publicly acknowledged until he chose justice over reputation. But she was always real. The ledgers prove it. The journals prove it. Her life in Philadelphia proves it. And in the archives, her story continues to speak across the centuries, a voice from the margins reminding every generation that no conspiracy of silence, no careful ledger, no social custom can ultimately erase a soul created in the image of God. Because some names refuse to stay hidden. Some truths refuse to stay buried. And some ghosts, the ones who lived, loved, learned, taught, and forgave, eventually step forward to demand that we remember. Not with bitterness, but with the quiet, unrelenting power of a life that simply refused to disappear.